Okay, hi everyone. For those like who don't know about Platypus, the Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. You can find out more at our website at platypus1917.org. So this will entail me presenting a short paper I wrote on the party question, and then after that we can open it up to Q&A and discussion. So let me begin the paper now. So the paper is called Preserving the Revolution, the Dialectic of the Party. And it starts with a quote: "The supreme law of the party is the preservation of the revolution." And this is Plekhanov in 1903. In previous articles, I've addressed the question of dialectics through Hegel, Platypus Review 135, and Adorno, Platypus Review 138. But addressing dialectics through discussion of individual quote-unquote thinkers lends credence to a mistaken idea many on the dead left hold, that dialectics is reducible to a matter of how one thinks about the world. This is a symptom of the apolitical character of the left in the present. Marxism and dialectics is reduced to being a better or truer way of thinking than other theories out there. But the extent to which the left does think of itself as engaging in politics, all talk of dialectics is dropped. But the extent to which the left does think of itself as engaging in politics, all talk of dialectics is dropped for the sake of fighting against the oppression of whatever oppressed identity is fashionable at the moment. In other words, there is an unacknowledged separation of the question of Marxist dialectics, conceived as a matter of thinking, from the question of politics. It is precisely in this way that Marxism is distorted in the present by the left. Because for historical Marxism, the question of dialectics was fundamentally a matter of politics, of the politics of revolution. In this paper, I want to address what this means through discussion of the party question in the Second International. My treatment might be peculiar because though the argument is based on historical research, it is not itself a presentation of the empirical history of the party question in Second International Marxism. Rather, I want to very briefly address theoretically and rather abstractly what the party meant for historical Marxism, and how this theoretical conception of the role of the party might help us get a grasp on what the content of Marxist dialectics was. My claim is that the party question raises how the party as a form of political organization can and must be the highest self-conscious expression of the Marxist dialectic. Despite my earlier criticism about reducing dialectics to a matter of individual quote-unquote thinkers, there is one figure in the history of Marxism who best exemplifies the profound recognition that party politics is the highest expression of Marxist dialectics. It is Lenin. What made this the case? Lenin understood himself as unoriginal. As I quoted at the beginning, it was Plekhanov, Lenin's teacher in Marxism, who at the Second Party Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1903 said, "The supreme law of the party is the preservation of the revolution." Plekhanov said the supreme law of the party is the preservation of the revolution. But it is Lenin, through his theoretical recognition of the role of the party, who profoundly and radically deepened the question of what it meant for the party to preserve the revolution. Why did Lenin think the party was necessary? Lenin's conception of the necessity of the party came from the recognition of the contradiction or dialectic embedded within the struggle for socialism itself. For Lenin, the economic struggle of the workers on its own produced what he called mere trade union consciousness, and was bound to remain within the horizon of capitalist politics. The consciousness adequate to socialist politics, to revolutionary politics, had to be brought to the workers from without, from intellectuals not ensnared in the immediacies of the political economic struggle of the workers, who, steeped in the history of bourgeois thought, could articulate the historical and political horizons of proletarian socialist revolution, the historical and political horizon of the seizure of state power by the working class. Thus, for Lenin, what preserving the revolution meant was preserving the contradiction or dialectic expressed in the struggle for socialism itself and politically objectified in the party. To preserve the horizon of socialist revolution, to preserve the horizon of the working class seizure of state power, for Lenin meant preserving the contradiction, the non-identity between the workers and their political economic struggle, which on its own reconstituted capitalism, and the theoretical and historical perspective of proletarian socialism brought to the workers by intellectuals in the party. The supreme law of the party is to preserve the revolution, because the supreme law of the party is to preserve the dialectical non-identity between workers' spontaneous consciousness and the horizon of socialist politics, to preserve the non-identity between the class and the party. The party is the political form which most adequately gives expression to the contradiction within the struggle for socialism itself. The workers' struggle for socialism simultaneously both reconstitutes and points beyond capitalism, and the party is the form of political organization needed to objectify and work through this dialectical contradiction. The party must preserve the political horizon of the revolution by preserving this dialectic. The most profound expression of this dialectic in history was the October Revolution of 1917, expressed in the dialectic between the Soviets and the Bolshevik Party. What did the Bolshevik seizure of power mean? It meant all power to the Soviets, all power to the self-organized working class. The Soviets were not an invention of the Bolshevik or any party. They emerged spontaneously in the 1905 revolution as the form in which workers organized themselves. Bogdanov, a Bolshevik in 1905, expressed his concern to Lenin during the 1905 revolution that the Soviets were in competition with the party. Lenin's response was that the party must learn to work with them. Though the Soviets emerged spontaneously from the class, what it meant to recognize and assert and enforce their power required the political articulation of a party not identical to the spontaneous organization of the class. The seizure of power in the October Revolution was history's most profound expression of the preservation of the dialectical non-identity between the party and the class. Perhaps the point can be additionally illustrated through raising the claim that Stalinism, in the name of the party, was in fact the liquidation of the party, the liquidation of the role that Lenin thought the party must play. Stalinism was the liquidation of the party because it was the liquidation of the dialectic, the liquidation of the non-identity between workers' immediate consciousness and socialist consciousness, the liquidation of the non-identity between the party and the class. It identified socialism with the spontaneous consciousness of the workers. It thus abdicated the role of leadership Lenin thought party intellectuals must play for the sake of preservation of the revolution. If socialist consciousness were to be simply identified with workers' immediate spontaneous consciousness, the political and historical horizon of world proletarian revolution would be liquidated. We can now say that over the century that's passed since 1917, all we have seen is the repeated liquidation of the horizon of the revolution, the liquidation of the dialectic of proletarian socialism, the liquidation of the task of the party, replaced by fighting the immediate struggle against workers' and others' oppression. For after all, one does not need a party of revolution to fight against oppression. One does not need a party of revolution to organize workers to improve their condition. One needs a party of revolution to objectify the fact that in the workers' struggle to improve their condition, they simultaneously reconstitute capitalism and point to a historical possibility beyond it that can only be articulated by intellectuals politically organized to lead them in achieving it. As long as the task of organizing a party for socialist revolution is avoided for the sake of intersecting the immediate struggle against oppression, as long as the task of developing socialist intellectuals steeped in revolutionary bourgeois thought is viewed as irrelevant in comparison to the need to fight the real fight in the streets, we will continue to suffer from a problem that, without a party, goes unarticulated. Namely, the problem of how our very struggles against oppression seems to reconstitute our domination again and again. This self-contradictory dynamic was recognized by Marxists long ago, and the party was meant to be the site of working through this dialectic. In the absence of a party, we are left incapable of even formulating the issue adequately, let alone solving it. The dialectic of the revolution still demands to be preserved, but without a party to give it expression, we are no longer able to even recognize it. Okay, so that's my presentation. We can open it to the floor if people wanted to raise questions or comments. If there are, who raised their hand? Is that you, Tom? Yeah, go ahead, Tom, and then Ephraim.
So I have a question about like I mean, there are different forms of the dialectic that Marxists have expressed. So, like, you have Lukács, which basically emphasizes the subject object identity, and the importance of being able to being able to grasp the totality, and you have Adorno, sort of basically that where the dialectic is sort of basically seems to be grounded on the recognition that you can't grasp the totality, that the concept is always going to fall below its object somehow, and like in Towards a New Manifesto, like Adorno and Horkheimer come out as actually being Leninists and wanting a Leninist party. I while I can really understand like how you basically combine Lukács's dialectic with conception of the Revolutionary Party, I'm less clear about how you can basically combine negative dialectics with a Leninist party, because the Leninist party seems a very sort of positive thing, and like a clear doctrine, a clear ideology, and it seems to be lacking in negative dialectics.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to emphasize in Lenin's theoretical recognition of the party, that the party is not a solution, but is itself the expression of the negative dialectic of capitalism, meaning that the workers' struggle, political and economic struggle against discontents raised in capitalism simultaneously seem to reconstitute the state, reconstitute wage labor, and yet point to the possibility of the proletariat seizing power and transitioning out of this. So I think for Lenin, the party is the expression of this negative dialectic, that the struggle for socialism doesn't proceed linearly, but that each achievement by the working class in the party deepens the contradiction of capitalism, makes capitalism appear more reified and with more power over society. Each step deepens this negative dialectic. Right. So I guess I was trying to do that, Tom, is to push against the notion of the Leninist party as a matter of simply adopting a program and then trying to implement it, but rather the Leninist party as the expression of the negative dialectic of trying to overcome capitalism. Ephraim, did you want
to? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, thanks, Omar. Um, I guess when you in an email promoting this talk, maybe you mentioned at the start, just before I came in, you said that you were partly inspired to do this by reading Deutsch's biography of Trotsky.
Uh-huh.
So maybe you could just expand on that a bit and say, because obviously what you've presented seems somehow kind of, as you said, removed from the empirical history. So maybe you could say a bit about how that inspired you to do this talk or to write what you did.
So I mean,
Yeah.
Deutscher's book is really great on like the kind of political life of Russian radicals and emigres, and so this discussion came up in the context of the second party Congress in 1903. And it's interesting to comment that Trotsky was very kind of skeptical of Lenin's conception of the party at this time, and Deutscher describes Lenin spending hours trying to explain to Trotsky his justification for the necessity of a centralized party. And it's in Deutscher's retelling of Lenin trying to convince Trotsky of his conception of the party that it became clear to me that something that might have been taken for granted could be talked about in the present, which is the dialectic between intellectuals and workers, right? Trotsky was skeptical of a party of intellectuals potentially substituting itself for the class, and then the Central Committee substituting itself for the party, and then a dictator substituting itself for the Central Committee. And it was in Deutscher's explanation of Lenin's explanation of the need for intellectuals in the party that kind of stimulated me to outline it very abstractly. But yeah, it really came from Lenin defending his role of the party in the Second Congress in 1903.
I mean, how distinctive do you think? Obviously, one of the issues that we discuss in Platypus is like Lenin's continuity with Kautsky and the Second International, and what is to be done, and the 1903 Congress where there is a division between Trotsky and Lenin. That seems to be for like later quote Leninists the origin of this idea of there being a separate idea of a Leninist party. I mean, how do you deal with that question? Do you think Deutscher kind of feeds into that at all?
I think Deutscher, I should have maybe laid more emphasis on the paper that even Lenin, when I talk about Lenin's conception of the role of intellectuals, of course, that's not original to Lenin. Of course, that's a Kautskian formulation. But so I don't think I think Deutscher recognizes that Lenin recognizes himself as being Kautskian in that sense, in the conception of the role of the party. But I think it's in the question of the Bolshevik-Menshevik split and Lenin being forced to justify his conception of the necessity of a centralized party that it became clear to me that Lenin, the way Deutscher was describing it, Lenin could be used as a way of showing what it meant to interrogate the theoretical center of the Second International. So I don't think basically that it's completely original to Lenin, but I think there was an articulation by Lenin that kind of made this problem the most self-conscious, that he was the most self-aware of this problem. I don't know. Does that make sense or answer your question, Ephraim?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I'm just sort of it's interesting, like the difference between 1903, like the different dates in there that you've got, like 1903, 1905, 1917, in terms of, and I guess you could even put like a slightly earlier moment at the formation of the RSDLP. I'll let other people ask questions, but thanks.
Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to say in response to that, I'm laying out a general kind of theoretical conception of the party that is not particularly necessarily original to Lenin in all circumstances. And obviously the question of what it means to preserve the dialectic between the party and the class is not just a matter of recognizing this abstract theoretical kind of problem I'm laying out, but it's always a matter of concrete political judgments. So maybe perhaps Lenin wasn't original in this theoretical recognition of the party, but in his concrete political judgments, he seemed to be self-consciously trying to preserve this dialectic. And other people made political judgments that were different, but not necessarily outside the framework I'm talking about. Yeah, any other questions? Sure, go ahead, Tom.
Well, it seems like what you're sort of what you're saying basically seems to counteract everything that I was brought up to believe. And because it seems to be saying that I was always told that the way that you basically defend the party is by defending the party program. And sort of, you look at like Cannon in the Cannon-Shachtman debates, that's there all the time. Sort of Trotsky sort of often seems to sort of talk about basically defending the program, the platform of the party, of the Fourth International, and it seems as though that's a very different emphasis from what you're saying actually is or should be the basis of the Leninist understanding of the party, which seems to be more of the rather than being the positive program of the revolutionary proletariat, or even their imputed consciousness, as in Lukács. It's more the party is about its own difference from the empirical working class. So it's about the difference between the revolutionary potential of the class and its actuality.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I would say simply it's the question of leadership that the party must lead, and that the spontaneous discontents and politics of the working class is itself what drives capitalism. And so the party must lead that struggle to the working class seizure of power. I would say the reason, I mean, perhaps in a political situation, we might be debating a party program. So this isn't like, opposed to that. Rather, it's that we deal with a kind of political impasse. And so in that context, it might make more sense to kind of talk about what the party meant and what was taken for granted and the conception of the party is in historical Marxism. And to show that this point, the absence of the party produces a real kind of theoretical problem, and that can we really make sense of the world in terms of Marxism without the dialectic of capitalism being expressed in the party? So I don't think it's opposed to the idea of, I mean, obviously I'm pushing against the idea that to form a program in the present is the number one priority. I think it's just a different emphasis because we're not really in a context, Platypus would argue, of political possibilities for even realizing a program. Tom, I think you're muted. If you're
what would be, sorry about that, what would be the primary political tack then, if you're part of the partyist factions within DSA? So you're saying that it's wrong for people like the Marxist Unity group to basically make such a big deal about the program. What should they be doing to actually set the basis or the foundations for a possible for a revolutionary party in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea. I would just say that for Platypus, the point is that to recognize the political impasse might be the first step, right? So it might seem that I'm setting up this question of the party to tell people, okay, go organize the Socialist Party. But rather what I'm saying is the absence of the party makes it difficult for us to get a grasp on what the problem of capitalism even is. That it's a kind of step before the question of what to do. It's that how is this project that's been liquidated the absence of the task of party consciousness to lead the working class kind of frustrates our ability to even get a theoretical grasp on society. Ephraim, did you want to?
I mean, yeah, if there's no one else jumping in, I'll go. Omer, maybe you're being not dialectical enough or undialectical. Maybe I want to push a bit on this kind of opposition of spontaneity and consciousness. Because maybe you're at risk of setting it up undialectically in terms of spontaneous action of the class and the consciousness of the party. Obviously, in a historical, I think it's important to sort of recognize the party as a historical development that's not unique to Marxist politics or even really to socialist politics. But also to say that, you know, in Chartism, for example, in the UK, the working class developed, you know, the spontaneity of the working class led towards the question of forming a party and the question of you know, taking power and revolution. And also there's the issue of like the Lasallian party. And so, yeah, I just want to kind of raise that the way in which Marxism already comes along to find working class party organization in Chartism as a means of kind of trying to push a bit about on the way you're setting up this opposition between consciousness and spontaneity, because I think it might
be a little too neat. It might be a little too neat, and you're right. I mean, that obviously, if this is an antinomy, both dialectically spur each other on. That the spontaneous organization of the class can lead to a political articulation at the level of the party. I mean, I guess I wanted to lay it out as this antinomy to say that for Marx, the necessity of the party and the fact that the revolution can't proceed simply in social civic action like it did in the bourgeois revolution says something about capitalism, says something about the Bonapartist state. Right? That why do you need a political party? Why can't the spontaneous collective action of society simply achieve the revolution on its own? That this says something about how the Bonapartist state, capitalism, reconstitutes itself on the basis of its discontents. So I guess my point about raising the antinomy is not to say that it's so neat and clean, but that the antinomy between social action that reproduces capital and the political task needed to overcome it is expressed in the party.
But do you think then maybe you're in danger of identifying the party with the revolution in a way where you might have a multi-party revolution and seizure of power?
Right. I think the question of what the revolution means, right, that the party doesn't have the idea of what the revolution looks like and then goes to try and implement it. Whether there is this kind of back and forth between the working class's political and social action and the party's recognition of what is needed to preserve the revolution, right? That it's not simply that like the workers reproduce capitalism and the party is there to make them make revolution, but rather both are needed to raise the question of what the revolution would mean, right? I think, yeah, I don't know. Is that David or Ephraim, you want to?
Hey, thanks, Lemire. I really appreciated your opening remarks, and I appreciate the prevailing discussion thus far. And sorry if this is a bit scattered. While the discussion's been going on, I'm like working on like a programming midterm for like my databases class, so please forgive me. But I mean, one of the things that this is like taking things in a different direction. One of the things that struck me was that the empirical kind of historical books that you were returning to were the Deutscher Trotsky biography. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I was reading recently that inspired this. Yes.
Right. And so that's interesting to me, especially given that what we're kind of coming up against in the past year or so is this kind of internal crisis of the DSA and the inevitable disintegration of the DSA as the kind of clot of the death of the millennial left. And the historical memory that's kind of generated from the groups involved, like Class Unity and MUG, tends to be focused around Chartism, as Ephraim was raising, and also like the 1870s. So one of the Parker, I think it was Parker McQueenie on one of our panels at the convention last year, said something to the effect of like we're currently living in the 1870s, right? And so there's a big difference though. So like they'll kind of interchangeably talk about the 30s and 40s and the rise of Chartism after the crisis of the Reform Bill. And they'll with the 1870s, which is the kind of rise of like mass Marxist-led socialist parties and the Second International, with the SPD as the exemplary model. And they'll just use those two examples interchangeably. But then there's also the kind of maybe deeper wound of like 1905 to 1917, the crisis of Marxism, right? Which is what I guess Lukács and Korsch will call that period. Where you do have a question of like the political party coming up because the political party is coming into crisis with itself. And so, I guess these groups, although that's not the kind of primary focus, like they're not like Leninists or something. It's not like I don't know, when there was the party question in like 2013, 2014, I remember like we had like a conversation with like Tom Riley, Mike McNair, and Chris about the party. And everyone was kind of talking about Lenin in 1905, like 1903, 1905, and like the Bolshevik Menshevik split, and the Bolshevik Party in the 1917 revolution. And that's where the kind of imagination was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so I guess like the categories that emerge from that period of like, the party of the vanguard or a Leninist party, those kind of continue to pervade the discussion, even though that's not really the historical material that's inspiring these groups. And so like to bring it back around to, maybe you could talk more about why you turned to the Deutscher and what you find useful about like adding this other moment into the mix. Like what do you think it kind of critically highlights if you're trying to highlight a kind of there's like a regression of our ability to understand, there's a kind of obscurity to even our ability to access critically thinking about the possibility of a party. Like why would this later period of like 1903 to 1917 be particularly relevant, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think like it's more for me. I don't know how relevant 1917 is. I think Chris once said Lenin's irrelevance is his relevance. That I guess my concern was more about how the party might be misconstrued to be viewed as kind of relevant and possible in the present. And this it is just about organizing a program and implementing it. Sorry, David, can you repeat your question one more time? I kind of lost.
Yeah, so it's like for Mug and Class Unity, who are like the two main groups in the DSA right now, who are trying to offer some kind of alternative. They kind of interchangeably talk about the 1840s and the 1870s as if they're the same moment, like Chartism and the rise of these Marxist-led socialist parties. And like 1903 to 1917, that stretch is like a very different moment. It's a kind of crisis of those Marxist parties, a kind of like critical reflection on them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, why is that particularly relevant with respect to the this kind of confusion about like Chartism versus like the tasks of a mass socialist party in the 1870s, if that makes sense?
So why is, for me, 1905 to 1917 relevant?
Yes. Yeah. Like, what drew you to that, and how do you
Yeah.
think it helps clarify the discussion?
I mean, I guess like in maybe 2017, 2018, I was going to DSA meetings, and it's like these are middle class academics who think that the role of like intellectuals is to like tell workers that like capitalism is unfair or that eat the rich or something, right? And keeping that in mind and reading the Deutscher material, I felt like what was liquidated was the recognition of the kind of critical dialectic of party and class, intellectuals and workers, for the sake of a kind of flat identification of the party with the interests of the working class, and that maybe that the role of the party was to be the most militant fighter of the working class. And so maybe this speaks to what you're saying. My recognition through Deutscher that Lenin thought of the party as the site of a problem, of a crisis that expressed the crisis of capitalism in general. I thought that could be an intervention to make, in the sense of saying that, look, the extent to which we need a political organization of intellectuals, it's not simply to identify ourselves with the immediate interests of the class, as Ephraim raised, the question of multiple parties competing for leadership of the class. Steve, did you? Sorry, Steve, did you have your hand raised? You might be muted.
Yes, sorry, I was. Yeah, thanks for having me. Obviously, I'm not a Platypus member, so thanks for having me tonight. A few things, really, listening to the discussion and some of the questions raised. The first one I'd say is an old phrase of mine that a lot of people seem to be putting the cart before the horse here. I mean, clearly, at some point, I think everyone here would agree that there's a need for a party. And Omer's explained why. But if we look at where we actually are today, and David has just raised the Marxist Unity Group and Class Unity. Now, as I understand it, Class Unity have actually just left the DSA. I may be wrong, but I think that's true. So they've decided to have some level of political independence as a party. And it brings to mind that Reed Coltis on Twitter immediately responded to them and basically said, well, good luck, guys, but you're not going anywhere. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, here. And he just said that clearly today, the necessity is essentially what Platypus is doing, to educate, to analyse, to clarify and define. So this is where I mean about the cart before the horse. We don't have the personnel today, even if people wanted to provide the basis for a party. Now, that's not to deny at all that it's necessary. In terms of what Ephraim's saying about is Omer being undialectical, well, maybe he is, but is that a really serious problem? Because I don't think, I'm not being rude here, Ephraim, but I don't think we can hark back to the Chartists, and we can almost not just hark back to Lenin. That was a completely different period, as Platypus members know better than me, where there was a socialist movement, a vibrant politically active working class. That is not at all where we are today. Politically, the working class is in the utter depths. I'm 66 years old and I can never, ever remember such a dire state of the political knowledge, let alone activity of the working class. So I don't think that we can almost jump on the spontaneity of the working class, i.e. like the Chartists did, and hope that we can just lead that even if we had a party. I think the task is much, much deeper than what Lenin faced. It's so dire, and I don't think that we have to approach that in a negative way. I think if we can get this right and make the right decisions and build enough personnel, you could say the future's really bright. But I think we all have to be honest here and address today's situation. So for me, the necessity of a party, maybe not today, but as soon as possible when we have the personnel, is actually to provide a complete polar opposite to the problem of the left and reformism and the 100 years of disasters that Lenin hadn't faced, the Chartists hadn't faced, but the working class today has faced. We are in a very problematic place. And if we are going to rely on the economic level activity, the spontaneity of the working class, and then try and lead it, where is the working class going to get even its spontaneity from today? Seriously, where is it going to come from? I think we must understand the depth of the problem that the Labour bureaucracy and capitalist parties have inflicted on the working class. And I really believe, truly believe, that unless there is a party, not just a revolutionary party to play the traditional role that Omer's described today, and we all have read the books and know about, we have to provide a focus, a serious political alternative for the working class. We're not even talking a pre-revolutionary situation here. I think that is an absolute necessity to overcome the depth of the depoliticization of the working class that's essentially been caused by the left and capitalist parties. I'm sorry, that's quite a broad range. I have a being in my bonnet about this. I've not completely formulated about all this. I need to write about it a little bit more. But I'm just sort of saying in a roundabout way that this is not 1848, this is not 1917, this is 2023, where not just the left, but the working class has suffered so many defeats. I don't think it can recover from them without a polar opposite party to lead away from the dead weight of history that the working class has suffered from. Sorry, that's quite lengthy, but thanks for bearing with me.
Sure. No, I would just say that for Platypus, the point is to recognize and attempt to dissolve ideological obstacles that stand in the way of a reinvigorated socialist movement or a reinvigorated socialist party. And I guess I was trying to kind of find the wound of what is the ideological obstacle of in relationship to the party. And I think for me, and from my experience on the left, it does have to do with a kind of uneasiness about the question of intellectual leadership of the working class movement. And it's often flattened into an identification of the working class with intellectual leadership. So, that might be a little undialectical, as Ephraim put it. The intention isn't to put revolution on the side of the party and reform on the side of the workers, but rather to say that without intellectual political leadership, this problem won't be overcome, and without the party, we can't even kind of conceptually get a hold on the problem of capitalism. But yeah, I think for Platypus, we're trying to raise what are the ideological obstacles standing in the way of the reinvigoration of socialism in a party.
Obviously, I basically agree with all that, Omer, and I think and Platypus has done a fantastic job, clearly, and politically it's given me quite a new lease of life, which I'm quite grateful for, I'll be honest. That's the honest truth from my perspective. I just think that we are all aware of the obstacles that you've just mentioned, Omer, and the problem is the obstacles have a complete political hold on the working class. There is no doubt about that. They've embedded such regressive reactionary politics for generations that it's a real problem, and that's why I'm suggesting that there is an absolute need, even in the midterm, to have a polar opposite party, a socialist party. Which brings me to another issue, if you like, of the situation of the dialectic between the party and class. And again, it relates to the hold that the labour bureaucracy and capitalist parties have on it, and how we should relate to those people, those obstacles. If they are such obstacles, and I believe they really are, I raised the question of that, at what level, at what points should, if you like, party members, socialist party members, stress the need to get involved in the economic struggle at the level of workplace? Now, that might sound quite an outstanding thing to say coming from my background, especially with the miners' strike and what have you in '84. But seriously, of course, there's potential in economic struggles to suggest the possibility of going beyond capitalism, but there's just as much potential that it really leads to just a reinvigoration of reformist politics. And as you said right at the beginning of your talk, nothing but a reconstitution of capital. So I think it's a question of, I really think at times we overly fetishize the trade union struggle. And at the end of the day, if it's not, it's as much a struggle against the labour bureaucracy as it is against the capitalist class. And I just think we over fetishize trade unionism per se.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I have something to say to that. I don't know if I do, but
Maybe I'll just comment on something Steve said, if that's all right, Omer.
yeah, go sure.
Okay. No, I think this is an interesting point, but again, I would say, like, we're not really facing the problem of a kind of economistic trade unionism. The kind of way in which the problem of social action versus political action, which Omer raised, appeared in the 19th century, is like very deeply submerged at the moment. And my experience of like what people think of as a strike wave in the UK at the moment is that it's already very politically mediated through the kind of concerns about the crisis in the Conservative Party, trying to call for a general election, people's discontents with Keir Starmer being the Labour Party leader. So there's a way in which the whole thing is sort of captured, and when we don't really have, I think, even a kind of opposition appearing between social action and political action would be a sign of a certain development that we haven't really even attained to.
Exactly. Yeah, sorry.
I just add, like, I just think that whole question of, again, it's like what Lenin said, like, you have to explain the spontaneity of spontaneity. I do think with the way Steve put it, it can come to seem a bit like, I guess that there's beyond like this opposition of consciousness and spontaneity, there's the broader question of society and whether society has tendencies and discontents that are going to necessarily arise in a way that have a potential to be politically organized. and how we understand the relationship between that and the kind of intellectual task of political organizing is, yeah, complicated. But I think I think there is a danger here of being opposed, of noticing the tendency on the left to capitulate to spontaneity, either in terms of strike action or in terms of a kind of reform, in terms of like protesty kind of revolution, or in terms of a kind of reformism, and criticizing that rightly, but actually preserving a kind of opposition between the two that remains reified and harks back to an opposition between social and political action, like I said, that we haven't actually sort of attained to producing as a phenomenon.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's what the kind of last paragraph of the presentation was about, which is to say the problem we face is not of a kind of flattening out, a kind of inability to recognize or come up against the contradiction between social and political action. That's to present the party question is not to say that, look, the problem now is people are liquidating consciousness for the sake of meeting the spontaneity of the struggle. Rather, it's to say that without the expression of the party, even that dialectical contradiction between social and political action isn't real, it's expressed. David and Steve, David, do you want to go?
Sure. So I wanted to ask you about your impression of what was going on in when you went to these DSA meetings or were engaging the DSA between 2017 and 2018. That because I think that in response to my first question, you said something like there was a sense in which there was a kind of spontaneous identification with the working class. And I wanted to push down on that and I guess get like a clear sense of what your impression was of what the DSA was up to and what their concerns were, and what that looked like. Because there's a lot of people probably who weren't around or politicized at that moment, even on this call. And I also think that this relates to Ephraim's question, because I just wonder what it was like. What was going on that kind of made you think of this? Like if we're calling it spontaneous kind of workerism or reformism, like what is the quality of it? If that makes I'm just curious how you would characterize specifically the kind of symptoms that you saw in the DSA then, and then I guess the tack onto that, I'd say like what's changed since then. But yeah, I think that's a lot to already answer for you. So,
I think I would address it also in the way it came up on the Platypus listserv recently, right? The question of can socialism be identified with the interests of the class, right? And I think this is what struck me about the DSA was that there was kind of this groping for like how to reach the working class, how to best express their interests. This question of we can't impose ourselves on the class, that we must let the class lead for itself. And I just thought, that this clearly expressed a kind of liquidation or crisis of what intellectual leadership once meant for historical Marxism. That, of course, the problem couldn't be solved by saying, look, the point is to build a party, but rather to show the ways in which the question of intellectual leadership and political leadership, which was so central to the notion of what Marxism was, has been liquidated for the sake of a kind of flat identification with the interests of the class. I don't know if I'm repeating myself. Did that
so like you would go to these meetings, right? And like in Cincinnati?
Yeah.
Okay. And they'd probably be like in a church or a library or something? Right. And they probably do like breakout groups or something.
Uh,
And then like what were people's concerns that you were talking to? Like so like who was saying this stuff about, because like between 2017 and 2018, at least in like New York and Chicago, where I had kind of encountered the DSA, um, they were kind of going door to door, trying to get people involved in local campaigns for elections, but also for like they're preparing for the midterm elections, and really they wanted the blue wave against Trump,
uh,
right? And they also wanted to prepare people for Bernie. So one of the things, like one example from Chicago is that they wanted to like push for this reform in Chicago where they would like, I guess, make public the energy company, ComEd, right? And which is a terrible idea, because it's like, well, who would become like the blue ribbon committee who would run it?
uh,
Like there's no one prepared to do
uh,
that. Um, and it would just become like a racket, which it already is a racket. It would just be like a worse racket. Um, so but you know, like that's what people like. So there'd be like a meeting about this, like the Green New Deal and how you're gonna help support it, like for the working class, right? And then people like the campaigners would ask questions of the leaders at the DSA. They'd be like, we're getting these crazy questions from people like, you know, people in Pilsen who are asking like, well, who would be on the blue ribbon committee to run this? And wouldn't it just be a rocket? And like, you know, like who's going to be responsible for directing funds to Chicago to run the energy company, right? Like asking just like normal questions of like, how would this even function? And the organizers were like, well, you know, Bernie, like Bernie will win in 2020, and then he'll be in charge of like distributing the funds. You know, like, it was some like crazy, just like insanity. But I guess like I don't know, I went deep into that example, but I guess the point was like, you know, like this is like the quality of like the action, like the social activity, if you can even call it that, because it's really not that, of these groups. It was like, you know, and if they did do a social service, like, you know, maybe they'd provide, I don't know, like some kind of mutual aid. You had like I don't know, remember like there was all these mutual aid groups, what they call base building. If you did have like a base building group, they'd be like providing, you know, breakfast for some like, you know, discontent, or they'd be like fixing brake lights, and they just want to hand out pamphlets about like Bernie's campaign and um whatever, like supporting Democrats in the city. So I'm like, you know, I'm curious about like what.
I mean, the Cincinnati DSA was like much less politically active, like in terms of concrete politics. But you know, I would attend their reading groups, and I just felt that like, so I thought it was a theoretical issue, right? It raised like a kind of theoretical issue for me, which is that like the justification of a theoretical perspective was that it was in the interest of the workers, right? That's what it struck. Like against Amazon. I mean, so it wasn't the concrete politics, but the self-justification that this is in the interest of the workers. That I thought that should be problematized. The question of Marxism or socialism's relationship to the interest of the immediate interests of the workers.
Which I suppose they would imagine to be these kinds of electoral campaigns, but also like the base building stuff as well, like
right.
the constituency building for Democrats.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess I just wanted to put some meat on it.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had more like, I mean, it was a kind of loose faction of college academics in Cincinnati. It was, they weren't conducting kind of a lot of political activity.
Right. So I guess like that's why I guess like there really is a kind of disconnect then, meaning like it's hard to imagine that this would be like a milieu, which, you know, like the so mug we'll talk about, right? Like if I was to put on my mug hat, I would say these people that you were encountering in the DSA reading group in Cincinnati, are like the neurotics,
I see what you're saying.
and our job is to like split them, right?
Right, right. And this goes back to Ephraim's point that I think is really important. That once again, this presentation is not to say like, well, this is what we need to do now, but rather to say that we are left in a position where we can't even recognize a contradiction or dialectic between social and political action, between the spontaneous, quote unquote, spontaneous action of the class and the consciousness that the party is supposed to bring about. That a kind of practical liquidation has meant a theoretical blockage. Yeah, Steve, did you want to? Or did Mandy have a hand up? No, Steve.
Yes, sure. Just to go back to what Ephraim's just said, I think Ephraim, you sort of made my point for me, unless I'm misinterpreting what you've said. I mean, you yourself and some other colleagues held in London recently the platform about enough is enough in the UK. For people who don't know, it appears to be a spontaneous movement of the working class, discontented people, of living standards, etc. In actual fact, it's not even that. I think Ephraim would agree. It's really a movement that's being created by the Labour bureaucracy itself, doing its old thing of using working class discontentment and using it as a stage army, as Ephraim said, to elect a Labour government and, if you like, get Labour bureaucrats into Downing Street again to play their traditional role. And that's the problem, and that's the point I was trying to make, is that even at the level of spontaneity, as we understand it, of economism, the working class is dead. It's the only spontaneity that we get at any level is completely controlled, manipulated by the Labour bureaucracy. It's a really deep problem that I don't think is recognised enough. I'll give you a small example. I hope Mike Atkinson from Manchester, UK, doesn't mind me mentioning him, but we attended one of these Enough is Enough meetings in Manchester. It was led by Labour Party members. It was quite a large meeting. Trade unionists were present, actually quite all sorts of people. There were perhaps 80 to 100 people there. And they went unchallenged, just gave their speeches. It was clear what their intention was. And actually, Mike spoke with an intervention that I'm suggesting we need more of. He spoke and polarized the entire meeting, speaking about the need for socialism, not in a dogmatic way at all, in a very common sense, ordinary way. And frankly, he almost brought people to their feet. And I also contributed with a little speech at the end as well. And that's the point I'm trying to make here, that until we make interventions at some point and move the Labour bureaucracy and the people in capitalist parties to one side, the depth of the problem will continue. Regression will deepen. That's the point I'm trying to make here. Now, I'm not trying to say, come on, Platypus, get your act together, go and form a party today. I wouldn't be so disrespectful. There's clearly still a need at the educational level and the numbers of people involved. I'm just posing the fact that we are not talking about a revolutionary party getting itself involved with a socialist movement. A socialist movement will almost have to be created. And yes, I accept that's extremely undialectical of me to say so, but I think that's where we are.
Yeah, I guess my last comment, maybe we can end it after this if there's no questions, is that, for Platypus, all bets are off. And in that sense, I think the question is, why not pose what the party was, even though its application might not be completely apparent, to at least raise the question of how, in the present, we've regressed from or liquidated what Lenin and the second international Marxists thought the role of intellectuals in the party was. Yeah, and without a kind of guide to action about how to proceed in the present, but rather to recognize that the absence of a party impedes our ability to even conceptually grasp the problem of capitalism in the present. David, did you?
Hey, yeah, maybe, I mean, another question I have for you, not sorry to build, like, sorry to keep tasking you beyond, hopefully it's not too much. But yeah, I guess another question I have is, so you raise the relationship between intellectuals and the party, but I wonder if another question that's being posed is the relationship between intellectuals and the working class. Because Chartism didn't just kind of emerge from nowhere. Kautsky, in the class struggle and in his other writings, actually details the way in which Chartism kind of arises out of these, intellectuals, these kind of like bourgeois radicals who are becoming interested in socialism. And there's a kind of like, I'll talk about like the socialists in parliament and the kind of Luddites, right? To kind of talk about it ham-fistedly, and that they don't have identical immediate interests, but they're being compelled together through Chartism over and against those kind of competing immediate interests. So like, I think this goes back to what Ephraim was saying, which is like, it doesn't seem like there's something in society developing or conditioning the possibility for that kind of spark to to use the infamous name of the journal. But like, there's not like where we could even talk about the spontaneity of working class action and its struggle for socialism, right? So I don't know, like, I guess to bring it back around to the question, like, so what then is the relationship between intellectuals and the working class with respect to your presentation?
Yeah, I guess I was also thinking about the question of like how this kind of goes beyond sociological classifications, that you could have a worker in the party, and as a function of being in the party, his role would be that of political intellectual leadership. And that you could have an intellectual who remains in his analysis at the level of the immediacy of the class, right? Yeah, so I guess I was defining it like intellectual and class in a kind of specific way. That obviously there are people of working class origin who rise in the party. But yeah, the point that even intellectuals might remain at the level of an immediacy that doesn't illustrate the historical potentiality or totality.
Like, what do you think the role of an intellectual is today?
Platypus. I think to raise the theoretical and ideological obstacles that stand in the way, not only of rebuilding a party or of socialism, but of even getting a kind of coherent grasp on society. I don't know if you had a more specific kind of angle you wanted me to address.
No, I mean, I don't have like there's not like a correct answer I'm looking for. I think this is one of the issues that's coming up, like, on the left. And so inevitably I would imagine it's going to come up for our members as well.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking as I was writing this about Adorno's is a marginality theory in practice, where he ends by saying only if the extremes come together will humanity survive, right? The extremes of, as he describes the working class, like misfortune of progeny that can't correct its condition, and intellectuals as dreamers, right? Workers as pure means, intellectuals as concerned with utopic ends, and that for Adorno, it's only in the meeting of the extremes that potentiality resides. I guess maybe that's a kind of subtext of the argument, that it's not about proletarianizing intellectuals. It's not about like, for at least historical Marxism, it wasn't about like intellectuals like going and getting proletarian jobs to be more at like one with the class or something, you know?
Which is something that like the Maoists at Columbia's campus are like peddling to students. And they kind of love that because they're afraid that they're not going to get the high paying tech job that they want. So it becomes a self-flagellating, self-fulfilling prophecy. But
yeah, because I think there is something that strikes us as kind of maybe fearful about the question of intellectuals leading, right? Maybe it's common sense to think, well, doesn't that lead to the replacement of the class by the party and the replacement of the party by a dictator? You know, I think these arguments do fly against the grain of the present and might strike us as kind of icky. But I think the point would be to recognize the potential real contradiction between intellectuals and workers and to pose what that contradiction might mean, rather than to try and, you know, join the working class or something. Any last questions? Okay, thanks everyone for coming.